If and probably when Florida State gets out of the ACC, is there an in-state replacement in South Florida just waiting right there?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth: realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do indeed apply. We'll check in on Penn State a little bit later. What happens if they miss the playoff? We're going to answer that question and more. And the most important game on Miami's schedule this year is not the one you would think. All coming up today. Let's start, speaking of the state of Florida, with South Florida. So I've seen this get suggested around the interwebs several times that South Florida could be a candidate in realignment, or a team that could, a chess piece, or whatever you would like to refer to them as. They're an AAU member. They have just made a big renovation investment into their football stadium. They're trying to get back to what they had in 2007, which is maybe the craziest college football season of all time. South Florida was in the top 5. They haven't been there in quite a long time. They did trounce Syracuse this past offseason, and going into this year in the American Athletic Conference, might be one of the best teams in the league. There's certainly a solid group of 5 team going into 2024. They would not be a viable replacement for Florida State. Couple reasons why. First of all, it sounds obvious to say, Spencer, Florida State and South Florida not in the same category. Yeah, that's the obvious part. I'm trying to go to the next level beyond that and look at why. Because geographically it would make sense. You keep a foothold in the Florida market if you're the ACC. You've got an easy geographical match with the rest of your conference there. That all makes sense. But remember, don't ever forget that Stanford, Cal, and SMU are already coming into this league at a reduced rate because they were not the most highly sought after teams or programs, universities in realignment. They went to the ACC because they couldn't find a better home, because it was better than being a part of the Pac-12 or being in the American Conference if you were SMU. SMU has quite literally bought their way into the ACC. I don't lament them for doing that. That's just the reality. I respect the fact there are people that want to get them back to being what they were once upon a time, well before I was born, and they got the death penalty for a fraction of what is legal nowadays in college athletics. That's a different conversation, though. But those 3 schools coming into your league, you think about it whenever you like, and you can say it was the right move and it worked out for all parties. Okay, it is diluting the quality of football in your conference. Stanford and Cal have not been great in a long time. I mean, Cal hasn't been great in forever. They've just been striving to be mediocre. Stanford hasn't been great in about 10 years now. Since Christian McCaffrey left, Stanford football has gone a little bit downhill. They had a couple good years, but they have not been good in quite a long time. And SMU is yet to prove anything in the Power 5 ranks. So you're already bringing them into the league. I don't think reputationally you want to bring in another school that was just playing at the group of 5 level. Now, you only added 1, whereas the Big 12 added several, and the Big 12 has certainly, in terms of the strength of the conference and the perception of it, yes, taken a hit without Texas and Oklahoma. It's survived, it's continued, but from a pure numbers standpoint, you don't need to add South Florida. And how much of that television market are you capturing there? It'd be a long-term play. That is for sure. But at the point in which Florida State and probably Clemson leave the league, what are the priority schools for ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips to bring in or to keep on board with the Atlantic Coast Conference? North Carolina is essential, and Miami is also essential. North Carolina State and Duke, they're kind of on that next tier, but it feels like they're attached to North Carolina, which is why the Tar Heels are priority number 1. But priority number 2 is Miami. Do you want to introduce an ACC competitor for Miami and make that a selling point? Because I don't know that the Hurricanes would look at that and say, yeah, this is in our best interest. Now, should South Florida challenge Miami in recruiting in a significant way? No, of course not. Mario Cristobal is one of the best recruiters in all of college football. But what kind of messaging does it send to the Hurricanes down there? That, yeah, we feel like we need to bring in this school. Miami's going, well, what? We can't carry the state of Florida on our own? We can't be the team down here? We can't fill a void left by Florida State here in a densely populated, highly sought after recruiting stronghold and elevate our brand even higher than what we've worked to do over the last several years and what they might do with a great college football season this year, something I will talk about later in today's show. I don't think that that's something that widely appeals to Miami. Now, I could be overlooking or I could be overestimating how much Miami would really value that. But South Florida is not an accretive or an additive institution to your conference. So when you've already brought in 3 schools that are not really additive, adding a 4th, I don't think benefits you. I would be more inclined to look at South Florida as an ACC expansion candidate if 2 things were different. Number one, if Stanford, Cal, and SMU weren't coming into the league, you're already bringing in 3 schools that have no recent history of succeeding at the Power 5 level. So if you want to make your conference into the strongest entity on the football field that it can possibly be, you're hoping one of those teams can at least move into the upper third, can at least be like a Duke the last couple years, or an NC State where they're a consistent 7-9 win program. But if you add another school into the mix, well, it's just going to get a lot harder for that to happen. Look at the Big 12. The Big 12 has added a whole host of schools, and they've got 16 teams going into this year. I think his number, it's hard to keep track with how much movement has gone on, but I think there are 16 teams. You know how hard it is for a few teams to establish dominance over the others when you get that many schools to go up against? I mean, that's the reality. Again, can't talk about Big Ten or SEC because that's a different conversation. They have different problems. They don't really have that many problems. They're doing just fine financially and team-wise and all that good sort of stuff. But for the Big 12, one issue that the conference has, and the ACC has this as well, is they don't have one premier flagship. Utah, for instance, is the favorite in the football, in Big 12 football going into this year. I think they should be. They have the lowest, as in the least likely to do so, odds, according to our friends at FanDuel, to win the conference of any major conference favorite. Ohio State, Georgia, and Florida State all have much shorter odds. They are way, way longer. I think I misspoke a moment ago. I apologize. They have much longer odds to win. And that makes the Big 12 wildly fun and wildly entertaining. But does it make them viewed as to be in a position of strength? Is it strengthening their league? I don't think it is. Because when you think about the best conferences right now, think of the SEC. What's a big game in the SEC? Georgia, Alabama. Snap it out. You know right away. You got big teams, big brands. You know they're going to be good year in, year out. Big Ten, what's the big game? Ohio State, Michigan. Every time. The Big Ten was absolutely strengthened by Michigan being better under Jim Harbaugh, being competitive and relevant. It strengthened the league. But in the Big 12, I don't know that right now I can identify a program that's going to pull away from everybody else. But the more schools you add into the mix, the more schools that are going to go after the same caliber of recruits in the same geographical area, in the case of South Florida, I don't see that happening. I think it makes it that much less likely. So that's the first part of it. And the second part of it is South Florida football hasn't been good in a really long time. You have to showcase. I would add, if I were the ACC, I'd be willing to add Memphis before I would add South Florida. I would, just based on football. Maybe they'll change the narrative in the coming years. They had a strong end to last season, as I mentioned, but you don't want to be adding someone that is South Florida going to pay their way into the conference like SMU? Maybe. To my knowledge, nobody has the sort of deep pocket donors that SMU has. And I don't think that they bring enough to the table athletically to offset that factor of they're just somebody else for a top tier team to lose to. You need big teams. You need big programs. You need flagship carrying schools that are the biggest brands in your conference that compete year in and year out. It strengthens your league from a television standpoint and a competitive standpoint. The SEC's had it for a very long time. The Big Ten's had it for a very long time. Who would it be without FSU and Clemson in the ACC? You make the argument for Miami, North Carolina, whoever you want. Whoever you want. You bring South Florida into the mix. I'm not saying it's altering the landscape, if on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is the most, it's not a 10 level shakeup, but it might be like a 5 or a 6, and I don't think it brings enough to the table. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments or hit me up on X. I have a question about Penn State, and we're going to answer that next, and that's what happens if they don't make the playoff? This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality candidates that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. It's why 2.5 million small businesses, they use LinkedIn for hiring with good reason. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Penn State is favored to make the college football playoff. What if they don't make it in the 12-team era? Zach Seyko, Locked On Penn State, joining me here. So let's start with that question, Zach. What would the mood be up there in Happy Valley if you just didn't make the playoff this year after so many years, as Joel Klatt aptly puts it, of being the bridesmaid but never the bride? And it's the perfect opportunity. And Penn State, if they just go 10-2, they'll do it. What if they go 9-3, miss the playoff?
My gut immediately tells me that the fire James Franklin chants get louder. They immediately get louder because this is always if they just had more teams, it's tough to get into the top 4, there's recruiting issues, there's, coaching issues, there's funding issues, there's NIL issues. And it's like, okay, well, now one of those boxes is checked off, guaranteed, right? They went from 4, not to 6, not to 8 to 12. Okay. So there's definitely plenty of space for Penn State to get in. And I forget how many times they would have if there was a hypothetical 12 team playoff going all the way back to 2014. But more often than not, James Franklin teams would have been in and probably won a game or two. Maybe obviously not a national championship, but they would have done well. So if they go 9-3, it's going to be very disappointing. I think 9-3 is certainly possible because if the deck doesn't break in your favor, this is the toughest schedule that Penn State's going to play in recent memory, probably over the past 2 decades, that I would say. I mean, you have to go to USC, you got to go to Washington back-to-back, then you host Ohio State. There's a 5-game gauntlet in the middle of the schedule that Penn State can afford to drop 2 of them, Ohio State being 1. So that means you got to go on 2 true road games against Wisconsin and USC, and hopefully you don't lose both of them. And you've never gone out to USC in the regular season like this. You've never hosted Washington behind Ohio State, right? And the schedule just is very difficult. So I have them at 10-2. I have them in the college football playoff. I don't know what that looks like for them hosting, whether or not I would think based on how many quality wins you would have hypothetically that it would get you a hosting spot. But if they were to miss, this 2025 makes a little more sense because I think the team is going to lose a bulk of its core. But this is like this Nicholas Singleton, Drew Allard, Denai Dennis Sutton, Abdul Carter. There's all these household names that are in their 3rd year ready to turn the corner. It's almost inexcusable not to make the playoff this year.
I look at their schedule and it feels very backloaded, incredibly backloaded. Now, the first game of the season, West Virginia fans were not too keen on a take I had earlier on this show many weeks ago about Penn State winning that game, and Penn State's a 10.5-point favorite on the road in Morgantown. Now, will they cover that spread?
Maybe.
That's a different conversation. That's a big number to cover against what should be a solid team in the Mountaineers. But I think if you win that game, which I expect them to, then it's 4 straight home games. And the toughest opponent is probably Illinois, because I'm not very high on UCLA, and the other 2 are Bowling Green and Kent State. Those are bye games against Group of 5 schools that Penn State is going to obliterate. And then it's at USC, at Wisconsin, host Ohio State, host Washington. I think if Penn State wins 2 of those games, they're doing very well. But let's go on the other side of the question that I started this segment with. What if they win 3 of those games and they only lose to Ohio State? Then it's hard to see how Penn State doesn't have an opportunity for the first time in several years to play for a Big Ten championship.
Yeah, they set themselves up very nicely. I mean, there's so many things that could happen, right? What if Ohio State comes in, they're missing a couple key players, and Penn State, that's kind of what happened in 2016, where against Michigan, they were missing a bulk of their starters. That was embarrassing. Michigan put up 40 on them, and it's like, okay, here we go again. Penn State's not turning the corner. And that was the same team that won a Big Ten championship. They got healthy. They upset number 2 ranked Ohio State team at the time. And it's kind of about timing. On paper, they lose that game to Ohio State. On paper, Penn State's 11-1. But I can't sit here and you can only look at the analytics so much to say, okay, how are they going to do with a 6-hour flight, charter flight in the middle of the season to go to Southern California?
Yeah, it's tough.
Then you have a bye week. Okay, that's nice. You have a bye week coming back from California, but then you got to go to Camp Randall and Wisconsin, and that's a rowdy place. So, and if Graham Mertz doesn't throw an interception to Jaquan Brisker the last time they're out there, Wisconsin's in game-winning position, right? So there's so much unpredictability with the schedule, and you can only look at analytics so much. You can only do so much predicting. But right now, if you look at on paper, Penn State should be favored in 11 games aside from Ohio State.
Yeah, and that Ohio State game, I want to touch on that because the record against Ohio State and Michigan for James Franklin is bad. There's no other way to put it. It is bad. Yes. Hope I'm not breaking news to any Penn State fans out there, but if you have not followed the program recently, Penn State has dominated everybody except those 2 of which they have been dominated by. Do you think that this Penn State team with Drew Aller at quarterback, new offensive coordinator, and a bunch of other really, really nice pieces. You mentioned Nick Singleton. He's not the only one. Julian Fleming comes over from Ohio State at the wide receiver position to bolster that room. Can they compete with Ohio State? Because you got them at home. And I think you look at the schedule, and you and I have kind of been talking about the Ohio State game as well. Like, that's automatically going to be a loss. But if you're going to beat them, it's going to be at home. So what chance do they have to beat the Buckeyes?
And I think, and it's not like Ohio State's going to be a 14, 17-point favorite. If everybody's healthy, I think the initial spread that came out was 3.5. So Ohio State right now at this time in the offseason is only a 3.5-point favorite against Penn State. So that's telling you, based on home field advantage, regardless if it's big noon kickoff, if it's white out in prime time, whatever they ultimately decide, right? The TV networks are just continue to mess around. Okay, that's a different conversation. But it's not like Penn State. It's like, whereas Penn State goes to West Virginia, yeah, they're a 10 to 12-point favorite. Well, Ohio State's only a 3-4-point favorite, give or take, in the initial spread. So Vegas thinks that the books think that Penn State is going to be really good. They think that Drew Aller is going to be better. They think it just, bear with me here, Spencer, and anybody else that's watching. It's like, Penn State is going to be the same as last year, but better. Okay. And what that means is they're going to capitalize on their strengths. They're going to ground and pound on offense. The passing game is going to be more efficient. It's going to be more efficient. Drew Aller's not going to throw 50 touchdowns, 4,000 yards. Everybody on social media can make fun of him. That's fine. But he's going to do what he does best, protect the football. And I expect that completion percentage to be higher because Andy Kotelnicki is going to make things easier for him. I was doing some film today and looked at, some tape of him, calling play Kansas offense. And it's like, man, he just made it so easy for whoever was quarterback there to succeed. Now you get a 5-star quarterback doing those same things. Hey, at the end of the day, I think Penn State is in a good position to be 11-1, 10-2 because the analytics can't account for that trip to USC. or Wisconsin back to back like that. So I think they drop one of those, and I think they do lose to Ohio State, because I think Ohio State is even being underrated at this point. I think they are a college football championship contender.
I think they're. Well, yeah, and the odds reflect that, and they should, but you never know. Nobody knew Brad Haley's name until he made the play. Someone's got to do it. It doesn't continue forever. Penn State isn't going to lose to Ohio State forever for the rest of time.
It's felt like a long time. It's felt like
so
forever.
they just have to ask themselves, why not this season? Michigan hadn't beaten Ohio State in how long? And then all of a sudden they beat them 3 years in a row. Only takes one season, one game, one moment to try and change the trajectory there. Zach Seyko, Locked On Penn State. Appreciate it as always.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Spencer. Anytime.
I was looking at the biggest games on Miami's schedule, and there's one on there that you wouldn't think about that they absolutely cannot lose. That's coming up next. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. No matter what it is, if it wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. It's a pretty sweet deal, and you should check it out. $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park, everything you could want, and all the college football gambling odds you could possibly imagine. Every single Week 0 and Week 1 college football game is available on FanDuel right now. All the lines are there. How great is that? Utterly fantastic, because the season is not as far away as you might think. So go check them out. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Win big. Add winning big to your summer bucket list. FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and our official sportsbook sponsor here at the Locked On Network. So without a doubt, Miami's one of the most interesting teams in college football this year, because you have Cam Ward and Damian Martinez coming in, Mario Cristobal going into year 3. They have a win total of 9.5. That's tied for the second highest in all of college football, according to our friends at FanDuel. They are viewed in the preseason right now as an ACC contender. I think they're capable of winning it. You look at the way they've stacked recruiting classes, what they've done in the transfer portal. They should have the guys. They should have the horses. They have a lot of big games. You're going to start with Florida. Massive game. Massive game in the Swamp. Week 1. Maybe the best game of the Week 1 slate. Miami at Florida. I'm so excited for that game. So very excited for that game. You know what the most important game on Miami's schedule is? It's not Florida. It's not Virginia Tech. It's not Florida State. It's Duke. It's Duke. I didn't say most important to their playoff hopes. I just said most important. Because Duke has the potential to really give the sense that Mario Cristobal is not the guy, which I do not believe personally. But you're going into year 3, and Mario Cristobal at this point has not actually accomplished anything major. He hasn't won a bowl game. He's only been to 1. The record's under 500. It hasn't been a sparkling start. I don't think it's been a disaster. The Georgia Tech game was a disaster, but overall it hasn't been a disaster. Hasn't been great. Not yet. But this year they have the potential to be great. So when you have an off season in which you're messaging to the fan base correctly, I'm not saying media outlets are messaging to the fan base. The coaching staff with these moves have an all-in mentality where they look at 2024 and say, we have a chance to win here. Florida State's the preseason favorite to win the ACC. I don't know if they're going to win it. DJ Uiagalelei is fine. He's not bad, but he's not that great. He's not Jordan Travis. So if FSU has the same caliber roster, and I don't know that they do, they have a very good one, but I don't think it's the same caliber as last year, and you've downgraded the quarterback position, which you have. Yeah, they're ACC championship capable. They're not ACC championship guaranteed. I don't look at Florida State and see them as ACC title or bust to have a successful season this year, because I think they're 80-85% maybe of what they were a season ago, just with a less prolific passing attack. They've had a great transfer portal offseason, but when you look at where Miami fits into this picture, the messaging from the coaching staff by bringing in Damian Martinez, who required a good amount of NIL dollars, and Cam Ward, who also required the same. Those guys made moves that kind of leveraged their situations to raise their NIL valuation or how much they could get. Cam Ward went into the NFL draft, and then he came back to Miami. You think that was cheap? My guess is it probably was not, because he's a really talented guy who has NFL potential. So when people like me come here and say, well, Miami should have big expectations, that's because the coaching staff is making us think they should have pretty big expectations, and they should. It's not just a sports book or media members. The coaching staff and the way this roster's been constructed, the way they've recruited over the last couple of years, and the way they talk about Miami football down there, the expectation should be ACC title contender. So then why am I saying Duke's the most important game? Spencer, what are you talking about? Because when you have that sort of preseason hype, when you have those sorts of aspirations, hopes, and capabilities, a lot of programs have the first two, but they don't have the third one. Miami's got all three. You can't lose to the guy who you fired to hire this guy. Because Manny Diaz, who I think could do a decent job over at Duke, is not coming into a situation in which much is expected of them here in his first year. Yeah, he's got Malik Murphy at quarterback. But do they have one of the top half rosters in the ACC? I'd say probably not. Maybe they just crack in, but they're closer to the bottom half than the top half. And are they going to have ACC title expectations? No, they're not. By the way, just so we are operating on the same wavelength here, I'm not predicting Miami to lose this game. I was just thinking about their schedule and thought, Manny Diaz had 3 years as the head coach at Miami. He didn't do poorly, but he didn't do great, and they made a change. And if Manny Diaz comes in with a program that is a basketball school, that game is being played in Miami. It is not up in Durham. That is in the state of Florida. That's a home game for Miami. With your new coach, who is much more highly paid than Manny Diaz, going into year 3, and you've got all these expectations, you can't lose that football game. You just simply cannot lose that football game. Because if you lose that one, number one, couple takeaways. Number one, I think it would be indicative of things are not going as planned or as they hoped for the Hurricanes. But number two, the optics of losing such a game would be disastrous. And I have gotten the sense in talking with Alex Dono of Locked On Canes and a few handful of fans. Granted, it's a pretty small subset compared to the entire Miami fan base, but Dono talks to them every day. And what he says is they expect Miami to be better. They expect them to be good, but don't expect them to make the playoff, though they have that potential. They have that capability. If they make the ACC title game, that's great. But if they don't and they're 8-4, 9-3, that's not going to be seen as a failure of a season. It's not going to be hot seat chatter. It maybe could be some warm seat chatter, lukewarm, above average, not room temperature, but it's not going to be hot seat chatter. And so if you lose that game against Duke, Manny Diaz in his first year at a basketball school with an inferior roster against Mario Cristobal in year 3 when they've got big expectations, that can turn the fan base against you, which is why Duke is the most important game. I bet Miami is a fat favorite in that one. They should be. Everything on paper says they will be. I mean, Miami, to be favored going into Florida is pretty impressive. Florida's not a bad team. I don't think they're a great one. They have the toughest schedule in all of college football. Everybody agrees on that. But that's going to be a pretty solid Florida team. Miami's favored in that game for a reason. And if you ask me right now, who would you pick to cover that spread? I might lean towards the Hurricanes. Even though it's in the swamp, even though it's week 1, and those Florida fans will have all the hope and optimism of a great season because their hopes won't have been dashed by their brutal schedule just yet. I think this Miami schedule is plenty workable. You don't have Clemson on there. You don't have NC State on there. You do have Florida State. You do have Virginia Tech, and you do have Florida. Those are probably the biggest games. But the most important game, don't forget about Louisville either. Most important game, boy, you can't lose that one against Duke at home. That would send a lot of the fan base. I think, I'm guessing, I'm inferring. But just ask yourself, if you're a Miami fan listening to or watching this, what would you be thinking or feeling if the Hurricanes walk away from that home game against Duke with any kind of loss, no matter what happens or what the circumstances were? Wouldn't be good. So that is why Duke is the most important game on Miami's schedule this year. If you want me to do this for your team, let me know. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.